Hi, I'm Ricky. Today we're on the 16th episode of the Endless Runner series, and in this episode we'll take a look on how to implement a new bouncing enemy to our game. We'll see how to make a shark enemy that bounces from side to side of the screen. This tutorial series is based on a game that I've already made and published called BoatVenture. You can play BoatVenture for free on the Play Store for all Android devices 9+. Alright, let's start. So the first thing I want to do is import the sprite that we're going to use for the enemy. I've made the sprite myself, you can download it for free, link in the description. Although I recommend you make your own since it's very homemade. Okay, and as you can see, I've named this sprite Orca and not Shark. And the reason is, because we already have a grey enemy, that is the rock, it's better to have enemies of different colors or the player will get confused. That's why I chose to make an Orca and not a Shark. Which in the end, it doesn't really change that much, you only change the color from grey to black. Of course, if you're an actual artist, then it's going to be a bit different than just changing the color, but whatever. Anyway, let's go into our prefabs and let's duplicate the rock. I'm going to rename it and change the sprite. Now let's make a new script and I'm going to call it Orca. And let's open it up in Visual Studio. In here, if you remember, we have a parent class for all our enemies, and that is entity type. In here, we need to move our Orca from side to side, check when the Orca has reached our side and then bounce it off, and finally add a bit of randomization to change the speed of the Orca and change the initial movement. So let's make a reference to our rigid body and our sprite renderer and get those references in the awake method. Then we need to actually move our Orca, and we're going to do this only horizontally by changing the velocity of our rigid body. And to change our velocity, we're also going to need a direction and a speed. So let's add these new two values. We're going to use xDirection only for calculations, while speed we're going to be able to change it in the inspector to make it faster or slower. Then let's make a new function to change the movement, and I'm going to call it move horizontally. In here, as I've said, we only want to change the velocity on the x-axis, and we're going to do this by multiplying the x direction by the speed in the x parameter. And because we are setting our force and not applying it, we only need to use the values without time.delta_time. Also, we don't want to interfere with the velocity on the y given by the spawn manager, so let's use rb.velocity.y to keep the y velocity. Now to actually call this function, we could just use the awake method, but because of how we are going to implement things later on, I can't really explain why now, let's use the start entity function. If you remember, start entity is a function on the parent class, so on entity type, that is invoked when the entity is spawned. So let's call this start entity function. And remember to use the public and override keywords to call it, and in here we just call move horizontally. Okay, and now we have initial movement, but we also want to bounce off the screen whenever we touch a side. So let's make a new value to hold the margin of our screen. And I've set it to 2 by default, because if you remember, that's also the xMargin for both player. And I've also serialized it in case we want to change it. Now in the update method, we want to check whether our position on the x is major than this margin or less than its negative. If that's the case, then it means that we are on the right side or on the left side. And when we are, we want to flip our entire Orca. So let's make a new function called flip. In here, we invert our x direction, so we multiply it by -1, we flip our sprite, and then we also update our movement. Okay, and that's about it for the major component of our Orca script. Now let's see how it actually looks like in Unity, and I can tell you already that there are going to be a few problems, but nothing major. Let's select our prefab and let's add our new script and remove entity type. One thing we also need to change is in our rigid body, we want to not freeze the position on the X. And we also need to add a new entity type to our script, so let's go in the parent class and let's add it. Okay, and if you remember, to add an actual enemy to your game, we go to our game manager, we select our get mob manager, and in here we add a new prefab. One thing though, to actually unlock this new enemy, we have to go in our Unlock Enemies Manager, and in here, in the Increase Difficulty function, we have to add a new Add Enemy function in our case system. So I'm just going to duplicate one. Now when we get to our third unlock encounter, that is when we reach the amount of yards that we want to reach in order to unlock something. First time we unlock the octopus, second time we activate the fog, and third time we unlock the orca. Okay, so let's go back to Unity. One thing we need to fix though, let's go to our spawn manager, and in here make sure that start entity is called after we set the velocity. Another thing, in our increase speed function, we currently increase the speed on the y-axis, but we also set the x velocity to 0. In case we spawn an orca before we have reached maximum velocity, then this function is gonna set the velocity to 0, and we don't want it. So to avoid that, we just change this value from 0 to rb.velocity.x. And you may see that this looks like horrible stuff, so let's also change the way we write this code. Let's cache the rigid body into a temporary value, and then we use that for the calculations. Much better. Alright, back to Unity. And now our orcas should actually work. So let's hit play, and you can see that the orcas are moving in the correct way. Perfect. Now let's add a bit of randomization. So let's go to our orca script. In here, in the start entity function, let's add a 50-50 chance of flipping the orca. And because we also call move horizontally in the flip function, we do an if-else system. But that's not the end of it. Let's also randomize the speed of our entity. So I'm gonna add two new values, a minimum speed and a maximum speed. And then in the start entity function, I'm gonna change the speed to one of those two values. Great, now let's see how it looks in Unity. Okay. As you can see, they have different speeds, which make it a bit more difficult and also a bit more casual, or rather more random, which is a great thing for endless runners. Perfect. Alright, and that's it for this episode. I hope you've learned something new. If you have any doubts about the code, something doesn't work, or if you have any suggestions about the next topic that you'd like to discuss, do tell me in the comments. If you like this content and you want more, like and subscribe. In the next episode, we're gonna see how to make a wind effect that is gonna move our boat left and right randomly. So be sure to stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video.